Hi, this is Marlene with Miami Ghost Chronicles, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Stories of the Supernatural. Wherever you find us, whether it's a video or podcast on your favorite platform, please like and subscribe to us so that you can get notification of when a new show is released. You can also find us on major social media platforms. If you go to miamighostchronicles.com, you can find links to the videos or MP3 files, which you can download and enjoy without commercial interruptions. If you're into classic horror, ghost, and adventure stories, I narrate Nightshade Diary, and you can find links at nightshadediary.com. If scary stories are your bag, and listening to encounters with cryptids, ghosts, dogmen, and other weird creatures sends a shiver up your spine, then go to supernaturalstorytime.com for links to our weekly podcasts. Noteworthy news about the paranormal world, true crime, conspiracy stories, and anything that is just plain weird can be found at eerie.news or visit the Stranger Than Fiction Stories tab at miamighostchronicles.com. Please subscribe to my newsletter on Substack. Just go to mppellicer.com for a link. I want to thank you for being part of my audience, and I think you are all wonderful. Hi everybody, this is Marlene with Stories of the Supernatural, and this week's episode we are going to talk about cursed and disturbed paintings. And I was surprised to find out there's quite a lot of them out there. Some of them are unusual or one of a kind, and others are very common. One of the first ones that we're going to look at is something called the spirit of the bartender. Bars, taverns, lounges, or even man caves could be the places with the best memories, or perhaps the ugliest and bloodiest ones. There are spirits, and then there are spirits. These are some of those stories. The writer of the story gave this example as similar to the one that was central to his story. The following is a story of a haunted bartender. Picture. This style of print is very common. In other words, this is not tied to an original artist. Perhaps what this person experienced is what happened around this print while it hung on a wall. This is the story. Quote, last year, my junior year of college, me and 4 other friends moved into a house together. We all brought our own things to decorate the house with posters, paintings, etc. One of the paintings was of a bartender pouring a martini. We would end up calling this painting the Martini Man. I had a weird feeling about it right off the bat. His wide eyes would follow you around the room, and there was just something creepy about it. When you were alone with it, it still felt like there was a real presence with you. About a month or 2 after the move-in, activity started happening. One day, I was sitting on the couch in the living room playing some video games. I started hearing slamming at the front door, and it was loud. It sounded like somebody sprinting and body slamming the door. By the way, we have a foyer, so I can't see the door from the living room. Thinking it may have been a loud knock, I go to see if there's anyone there. Nothing. This persists throughout the day. I get up several more times to see if anyone is there. Nothing each time. It's the middle of the day, so I'm more confused than creeped out. I decided to test the door, shaking it, slamming it, knocking on it, even jumping into it. Nothing I did was close to as loud as the noises I was hearing. To top it off, this happened one day and one day only. I never heard this happen again. Not necessarily attributed to the painting, but I'll explain how it connects later. The last personal story is about the footsteps. This happened in the summer when it was just me and one other guy living in the house. It was about 2 a.m., and I was lying in bed playing on my laptop. I started hearing really loud footsteps coming from downstairs. They were like fast stomps. It sounded like someone sprinting while completely drunk. At first, I just thought it was a drunken roommate, but there was something strange in the pattern to them. I would hear them start in one part of the house, stomp to another, stop for a while, then pick back up in a completely different part of the house. Eventually, they came running up the stairs directly to my door and stopped. I was frozen with fear during the silence. They then started up again, downstairs this time. I kept going for at least 10 more minutes. I should probably explain why I pinned all this on the painting and not the house itself. As I already said, Its eyes would follow you around the room and had an overall creepy vibe to it. People would come over and say that the painting scared them without hearing any of these stories. We had some girls over for a party, and they insisted that we take the painting down. I hastily agreed and took it off the wall. That's when I saw written on the back of the canvas the name of the painting, The Spirit of the Bartender. Quite frankly, I thought this was hilarious, as I had been expressing my distaste for this painting to my roommate for some time, and this corroborated my claims nicely. After that year, the roommate to whom it belonged moved out, and he took the painting with him. The activity died down after that. He ended up giving it to the bar he worked at, and they threw it out after only 2 weeks. I can imagine why. We actually managed to find the artist on the internet, and it seems he just paints the same thing over and over again. We'll attach an image, which, by the way, you guys will see. For those of you watching the video version of this story, you're going to see I have 2 or 3 versions of that same style. Now, there's a reader of that story that commented the following, that read that original story. My sister was a maritime artist. She committed suicide last July in West Palm Beach. My wife and I bought a lot of her unsold pieces back. Some are really well done, so we hung several of the larger ones. Meanwhile, my sister's ashes got lost in the mail when the mortuary sent them back to me in Houston, Texas. It took 2 months, and her remains made several round trips from Florida and back. However, my sister did love to travel. Once the ashes finally arrived is when the trouble started. When we got in an argument about her, one of the paintings always falls off the wall. Her ashes are in the guest bedroom closet. The guest bedroom was our 3 house cats' favorite afternoon hangout. Now, they refuse to go in there. My father-in-law has a hatteras with a large enclosed cabin that can accommodate several people. We're going to invite some of my sister's closest friends and go out a bit in deeper water. There is a large back deck and a door in the transom, so you can step down near the water. We will go when the weather is calm this summer, spread our ashes, and give our cats their hangout pad back. So see, that's another instance where something about a painting has an unusual effect to the surroundings. Now, this is a story about a picture found at the John Ringling Museum. Quote, I visited the John Ringling Museum of Art and Estate in Sarasota, Florida a few years back. There was a haunted painting there. It was a portrait of a young woman wearing a deep emerald bodice and a blue scarf on her head as she looked down with her body turned down a bit, and it cast a shadow on her breast. I took a photo because the depth of the emerald velvet bodice seemed to be an abyss. It was so dark, and the painting had a licked surface, which Dutch painters from the Renaissance era would use as a technique to diminish brushstroke textures so that colors and implied textures were more intense. Her eyes were so sad. The textures were so rich, too perfect. I decided I didn't like this work after all. When I was looking through my pictures later, I noticed a red devil or demon looking thing where the deep abyss of the dark green emerald was when I saw it in person on the wall. I showed so many people this picture and asked them if they saw anything unusual, and every single person saw that red demon right away. It was not on the painting at the museum, but it showed up on my picture. No other photos had these red obstructions or whatever in them, but I took multiple pictures of this painting from different angles, and every picture has the red demon. Okay, now, this is a story, this is historically accurate, by the way, about something that happened to a bartender. It's February of 1893. There's a bartender, his name is J.M. Robinson, but they call him Mont for short. He's a bartender who lived in Summitville, Indiana, and he drowned himself. He went to a gravel pit filled with water near town and left his coat and hat on the shore. He was 40 years old and left behind a wife and 4 children. He had some financial reverses and his health was bad. The pond was deep, and saloon men from where he worked had been cutting ice from it during the cold weather. The next day his boss passed by and saw the hat and coat on the bank. Right away he realized they belonged to Robinson. Suspecting what the man had done, he went back to town and brought a party of friends with grab hooks and dragged the bottom thoroughly. Eventually, the body was found and taken to his home. It seemed that once Robinson lived in good circumstances and owned a farm near Summitville, but he lost it through bad management and sickness. Less than a month after he died, Mount Robinson was seen near the pool where he drowned. People who passed by the area at night, which was half a mile outside of town, would see him standing on the bank of it as in an act of plunging into the pool. It seemed he didn't realize he had been successful in ending his life. And it's a tragic story, because it makes you wonder, was he not sure that he had been successful, or maybe he had changed his mind, but it was too late. This next set of stories have to do with curbside treasures. Not all of these are paintings. They could just be objects. Have you ever driven by furnishings and belongings left at the curbside, which seem too good to be true? Why would anyone give these things away for free, you ask yourself. If you knew the answer, you would peel out and just watch the items grow smaller in the rearview mirror. Lastly, you would sigh in relief. Now, the first part here is something called the name of the painting. The way it was named is what it looks like. The Lady in the Turban. It's 2018. There's a woman named Mel Hamilton. She finds a painting of a woman with a turban next to a commercial bin on a Brighton street. This is in the UK. It had a broken frame, which she assumed was the reason why it was thrown out. She soon came to suspect that it had been discarded for darker reasons. She reframed it, and everything in her life took a turn for the worse. Mel left with her clothes, her dog, and the painting when a relationship with her partner ended. At that point, she was so drawn to it, she decided not to leave it behind. It was signed with what appeared to be the name Shoanziza Ekele and the date 1973. This might possibly be a Nigerian name. Soon after moving into a new apartment, her old but healthy German Shepherd dog died unexpectedly. That's when she started to experience the dark and unexplainable activity that would haunt her for 3 years. Doors would open and shut by themselves. The TV would change channels without the aid of a human. Once she awoke when she heard the jingling of keys opening the door. She said, "I would hear the door handles move and the keys go in and out. This overwhelming darkness was awful, and I was alone." It very quickly became apparent that something was amiss. Everything was going wrong. Everything. Plants and flowers would die soon after she brought them home. She came to believe a dark entity had attached itself to her when she was the most vulnerable. She was battling alcoholism, and when she tried to tell others of her experiences, they dismissed it as her being drunk. She lived in Ramsgate and said, "Things got really, really unbearable. There was so much activity that I didn't want to live there. The energy in it was just so bad and so dark. I was a nervous wreck and covered in crosses. I went to a meeting and tried to sound rational, but nobody believed me." 3 years later, her son threw the portrait out, and the ill fortune stopped. She became sober, started a relationship with a new man, and felt comfortable in her home. The conclusion was inevitable. The harbinger of the dark activity was the portrait. Now, the next painting is called The Captain's Portrait. Like many haunted places, especially those visited by the public, it's only after hours that the unusual starts to occur. Such is the case at the Corned Beef and Company in Roanoke, Virginia. The source of the disturbances, according to the employees, is a portrait of Captain Andrew McKeever. Present day, the warnings are heeded, so the picture's only dusted but never moved. Why? Because if you do, then the ghost will start following you around. Some believe just being around the portrait will provoke the captain. He flicks lights on and off. Others have heard the activity in the billiard room when the restaurant is closed, voices heard in another room, and their name being whispered. The general manager said, "A girl was hanging Christmas lights around the captain. She actually touched the painting. She cut her hand pretty bad that day at corned beef. The people that touched it and tried to clean it, they saw shadows walking around. Things would get knocked off the countertops." Captain McKeever was a World War I Canadian two-seater flying ace who, in conjunction with his gunners, was credited with 31 victories. All but two of those triumphs were over German Albatross DV fighters. Once the war ended, he wanted to stay close to his passion and he accepted a job as a manager for an airfield at Mineola, New York. Ironically, after so many close calls during wartime, before he could start work, he was involved in an auto accident in his hometown of Listowel. He broke his leg, complications set in, and he died of cerebral thrombosis on Christmas Day 1919. He was 26 years old. There you go. And isn't it ironic? Here this guy is in World War I. He's credited with 31 victories. He lives through all that, but dies of a weird accident. Now this next painting is called The Two Dolls. It's March of 2022. It's a painting of two dolls that was posted on eBay. Like many similar items, they're put for sale either for the notoriety or fear. The man who bought it said the item ruined his life. Using the pseudonym of Dan Smith, he describes himself as a collector of weird things, and a visit to a flea market is when he came across the innocuous-looking painting. The woman selling it, she's trying to warn him away. So it's one of two things. Either she wanted a clear conscience, or she used the oldest but best sales pitch to use on collectors, which is don't take it, that reverse psychology. Well, it worked, and he bought the painting. This is how he described the painting on eBay. Quote, "Beware, cursed vintage painting, dolls art creepy, eerie. Warning, 1967. The woman at the flea market warned me before buying this, and I will warn you. No good can come from this painting. I didn't think much of it at the time and just assumed she was one of those oddball dealers hawking their wares for cheap. As for the painting, it looked adorable, with two innocent-seeming dolls portrayed in it. But she was right. Don't be deceived. I don't know whose cursed blood was mixed in with the paint to create this piece, but its powers are strong." End quote. Now, once he got the painting home, he was visited by biblical-type manifestations. He had an insect infestation, his once healthy hamster died, and he lost sleep. He suffered from sickness, loneliness, sleeplessness, and uneasiness, and believes that the only recourse left to him was to get rid of the creepy picture. He noted the only difference in his life before it took such a dark turn was the purchase of the painting. He said he didn't destroy it, for instance with fire, but he feared it could easily unleash the evil and make things 10 times worse. He didn't want to risk this, but instead decided to sell it to someone who doesn't believe in curses, or someone who does but is attracted to it, just the way he was. This is further information that he had on the listing. Quote, "For the details on the piece, it comes with a frame. It is dusty, since I never got around to cleaning it off after hanging it. As for that artist, it is signed with the initials MNP 3-67. Of course, that could also just stand for something like many nightmares and phobias, which is what the artwork leads to. I am starting the auction at $50, which is what I paid for it, but I'm hoping it goes for more to make up for everything I've been through. But before you bid, you've been warned." End quote. Lest you think your chance of buying a creepy painting off eBay is lost, fear not. These were offered in September 2023. So there you go. Again, how much of it is real? How much of it is hype? I guess some people, they're always tempted to find out which version of the truth it is. Now, these other sets of paintings, they're all what we call cursed women. Of course, the subject, they're women, and you'll see what I mean. Now, many of these creations on canvas are at times described by the artists as being inspired from something outside themselves. Are they portraits or portals? The first one is a painting called The Rain Woman. Okay, it was created by a Ukrainian artist named Svetlana Telets. She was a newly minted artist who graduated in 1996 from Grekov Odessa Art School. Then she started to suffer nightmares and the feeling of being watched by someone or something. The spell she had endured for 6 months was broken one day when she took her paintbrush and produced the painting. She titled it The Rain Woman. She painted it in only 5 hours, and she said she had never seen this subject before. She said, quote, I always felt like someone was watching me. I always drove such thoughts away. Then one day, by the way, it wasn't a rainy day at all, I was sitting in front of a black canvas and thought of what I could draw. Suddenly, I saw clearly the contours of a woman, her face, colors, shades. I saw every detail of the image. I started to draw it, as if someone drove my hand over the paper. In 5 hours, I managed to finish it. End quote. She exhibited it in Venezia at a local salon. Connoisseurs came up to her and shared the same impression she had felt while she worked on it. The portrait sold quickly. The customer was a businesswoman who hung it in her bedroom. Within 2 weeks, Svetlana heard from the woman who was frightened. She said, Please pick her up. I cannot sleep. It seems that there is someone in the apartment besides me. I even took it off the wall and hid it behind the closet, but I still can't do it. The second person to bring it home hung it in his living room. He found that he soon couldn't stand the portrait. He returned it and took only half of what he paid for it. He said, I dream about her. Every night she appears and follows me like a shadow. Another man, a skeptic, had already seen the painting before he bought it. His skepticism turned into fear when he started to see the lady with her white eyes everywhere. When he returned it to the salon, he said, At first I didn't notice how white her eyes were, and then they started appearing everywhere. It seemed that a little more and I would drown in them. I'd rather buy something classic. It hung at the Venezia Salon, Merck's Furniture in Kiev. Customers who visited the shop claimed that sometimes you could catch the painting smiling, and to some there was often a glance of anger. The publication KP asked the artist if she was looking for a new owner. She said, I'm in no hurry. I'm sure that each painting is born for a specific person. I believe that for the woman, there will be someone for who it was painted. I understand that many people don't need this melancholy in her eyes now. It's just not interior design, but someone is looking for her, just like she is looking for them. According to Archpriest Vitaly Golosevich, a priest at the Transfiguration Cathedral, Venezia, said, quote, A person has a spirit and a soul. They are truly spiritual works of art, and they are spiritual ones. And the painting you are talking about represents just such soulful art, but it does not come from God. Before buying a painting, I would advise you to listen to yourself, to your feelings that remain after contemplating the creation. The artist put into the work the mood in which she was in at the time, and it is unknown who directed the artist at that moment. Therefore, if it was something unclean, then even consecrating the painting will not help. End quote. In 2008, Sergei Skachkov, frontman of the group Zemlin, which I believe translates to Earthlings, read about the painting while flying to a concert in Kiev. The painting appeared on the cover of Komsomolskaya Pravda. He read the painting had been looking for an owner for 11 years. This is when he decided it should belong to him. Svetlana was asked to take the portrait to Kiev for the new owner. She said, I approached the woman and mentally asked, if you want to live with this musician, make sure everything works out. And I felt her silent consent. She turned the painting over to the musician at a hotel with the impression that she herself wanted to leave me. Is the painting cursed? Or is it a question that the buyers were primed to believe it was evil? Now, I haven't heard anything else. And as far as I know, he kept the painting, so I guess it worked out. And she wanted to be with him and vice versa. True love. Now this next portrait, it's got one of these long titles. Portrait of Miss Henrietta Nelson in a blue and white gown and white hat holding a rose in a rococo interior. Henrietta, let's call it for short, Henrietta came to Yaxley Hall in England in 1739 when she was 5 years old to live with her great aunt Margaret Leake after her parents died in a carriage accident. A few years before, in 1727, Robert Yaxley was found almost dead on the road with his skull broken and his pockets turned out. He was not expected to live. This is when the Leakes came to Yaxley Hall. Henrietta's portrait was painted in 1780 by William Johnson. She was only 46 years old when she posed for it and lived many more years until 1816, when she died after falling down a flight of stairs from her bedroom. The unmarried spinster was 82 years old. Fulfilling her wishes, her cousin Francis Leake built a private mausoleum for her on the grounds of Yaxley Hall. Francis died in 1836, and his daughter and her husband decided to move and dismantle the mausoleum. They placed her remains in the graveyard of the nearby church of St. Mary, which dates back to medieval times. Her portrait hung at the home of a family friend in Norfolk for many years. That's when people said the woman in the painting was watching them. It went to other places and was gone almost a century before the portrait was returned to Yaxley Hall. Perhaps her absence did serve a purpose, since the manor built in 1520 had 2 wings burned down in 1922. A ghost fitting Henrietta's appearance in the painting is said to be seen on the grounds. The reason she is said not to lie quiet in her grave is due to the destruction of the mausoleum. And what's really interesting is that obviously the portrait was there, it was moved around so it escaped being burned. But her ghost is seen wearing that clothing, which, by the way, is the title of the painting. And all because, for whatever reason, she didn't want to go to the graveyard mausoleum with the family. She wanted her own little crypt there on the grounds, and when they destroyed it, that's when everything went south. Now, this other portrait is very basic. It's titled Portrait of a Lady. Now, the lady in question is named Paz Pardo de Tavera. She was the wife of the artist Juan Luna. He produced the work in 1890. This was 2 years before he murdered his 28-year-old wife. The painting is said to cause misfortune and death to anyone who owns it. The source is said to be the spirit of Paz. She brought death in car accidents, misfortune in finances, and miscarriages and ill health. Juan Luna de San Pedro y Novicio Ancheta was a Filipino artist born in 1857. He would go on to study art in Europe and lived in poverty while producing many of his famous works, until he won prizes for some of his paintings. In Paris, he rubbed elbows with Filipino artists and intellectuals, among them Trinidad and Felix Pardo de Tavera, who would eventually introduce him to their sister. In 1886, he married Maria de la Paz Pardo de Tavera y Goricho, who was born in the Philippines, a mestiza of Spanish-Portuguese extraction. She belonged to a very wealthy political family in self-exile from the Philippines, and had lived most of her life in Paris. Her mother did not approve of the match, but was convinced by her sons. In the 6 years of their marriage, Juan and Paz had 2 children, Andres and Maria de la Paz. In 1892, Luna lived with his wife, her 2 brothers, and his mother-in-law at Villa Dupont on Rue Pergolese in Paris. Next to the cottage, Luna had his atelier or studio where he worked on his paintings. There are various versions of what happened in September of that year. But one thing is certain, which is that it was precipitated by Luna suspecting his wife was unfaithful to him. She had spent 2 months in Montour recovering from the death of their daughter, Bibi. Upon her return, he threatened her with a revolver, but she admitted nothing. However, of one thing he was convinced, which was that his wife did not love him any longer. He told her they, along with their son Andres, would leave for Spain. It was said that Paz was terrified of her now paranoid and violent husband, and she was convinced by her family to stay in Paris and obtain a separation from Luna. Whether she didn't want to leave in the first place, or she was convinced by her family, on the day they were to leave and the luggage was packed, Luna came to the house and found a solicitor waiting with his brother-in-laws. Later, he told police this story, quote, "His wife and mother-in-law were locked in the bedroom upstairs. Then he heard them crying out from a window, 'Help, help, my husband wishes to kill me.' I understood it all. I was caught in a trap. My wife and mother-in-law wished to pretend that I struck them, and the solicitor and my two brother-in-laws, who were below in the garden, were there as witnesses. Thus my wife, her mother, and her brothers would gain their point, namely, be able to issue against me a writ of divorce." After finding, end quote, after finding the bedroom door locked, he went downstairs and grabbed a revolver. He shot one of his brother-in-laws, Felix Pardo de Tavera, who was wounded and would survive. He broke down the bedroom door and then the bathroom door, where both women were hiding, and shot them both. His mother-in-law died instantly, and his wife, who was shot in the head, would linger 2 weeks before dying. Luna tried to shoot himself, but a servant took the gun from him. Later, Luna admitted he was prey to intense jealousy when it came to his wife. It was rumored that he had no money and the family was kept by his mother-in-law. Police arrested him and he went to trial for the crime in February of 1893. Like the murder, there are two versions to the outcome. In one, he was acquitted and he moved to Madrid 5 days later. In the other, he was found guilty, but because it was a crime of passion, he was given a light sentence, which was banishment from Paris. He left with his son Andres, who was 5 years old, and witnessed the murder since he was in the bathroom when his mother and grandmother were shot. It was rumored that Dr. Trinidad Pardo de Tavera decided to burn all of Luna's paintings in his possession, and for years there would be none of his works in any Pardo de Tavera's household. Can you imagine this artist who was your brother-in-law killed your mother and your sister? This doctor, he continues to live in Paris, and he died in 1925. He's buried in the Père Lachaise cemetery. In other words, he never returned to the Philippines. However, Luna did return to the Philippines in 1894, and he was arrested in 1896 for sedition. His brother belonged to the Katipunan movement, who were described in the newspapers of the times as a murderous secret society whose object it was to secure the freedom of the Philippines by putting to the sword all the Spaniard in the archipelago. Luna was pardoned and left for Spain. 5 years after he killed his wife, Juan Luna died on December 7th, 1899, in Hong Kong when he heard of his brother's death at the hands of soldiers loyal to General Emilio Aguinaldo. He was 42 and buried at Happy Valley Cemetery, but in 1920 his remains were removed and kept at his son's house and later transferred to a niche at the crypt chapel of San Agustin. The portrait was originally titled Pardo de Tavera before it was changed to Portrait of a Lady. How the painting made its way back to Manila is a mystery, and the nexus of its curse remains just as obscure. Its first owner, Manuel Garcia, sold it after business took a downturn. There was a mention of a couple who owned it in 1980, and their house in Forbes Park burned down, but the painting was saved. Then it came into the hands of Betty Bangtung Benitez, who died in a freak automobile accident in 1981, when a car she was a passenger in drove off the road and hit a tree. Vicky and Tony Nazareño purchased it next, and soon after the family closed one of its biggest stores. Then Tony got sick when his carotid artery got swollen and the doctors couldn't figure out what was producing this symptom. He also started to experience high blood pressure. Eventually the couple would separate and Tony Nazareño's condition got worse. He would die in 2005. The painting was exhibited at art shows during the 1980s. This is when Imelda Marcos saw and acquired it. It was hanging in the office of the Philippine president when Ninoy Aquino was assassinated in 1983. Aquino was a political opponent of President Ferdinand Marcos, who would be exiled in 1986. Then it went to the home of Ime Marcos Manotoc, during which time it was said she suffered a miscarriage. Susano Gonzalez, also known as June Gonzalez, a famous art restoration expert from the 1970s and 80s, did work on the Luna portrait. He would be gruesomely murdered about a dozen years after he worked on it. It was donated to the Metropolitan Museum in 1986, and on the opening night in 1987, the spotlight over it exploded. No other lighting in the museum behaved this way. One of the biggest mysteries is that the lady in the portrait doesn't look like Paz Pardo de Tavere. Her skin color is too light, which leads some to believe it was a favorite model of Luna's named Mademoiselle Angela Douche. Others believe she's an idealized version of Paz. But would a jealous man like Juan Luna paint his wife with a partially exposed breast? Another portrait produced in 1892, the year Luna would kill his wife, titled The Parisian Life, has an unnamed model who, again, some believe are his wife or Angela. Juan and Paz's son Andres Luna de San Pedro, also known as Lulín, would go on to become a successful architect. He designed the Crystal Arcade, which was inaugurated in 1932, built on land owned by his maternal family. During World War II, more than 80% of Manila's structures were destroyed. The Crystal Arcade was located in an area of the most fierce combat. After the war, the first floor was occupied by stores, and the second floor was used for storage. It never regained the elegance of its original design and was razed in the 1960s. Some believe the structure was burned down because Lulín kept the urn of his father's ashes in there. Now, the next set of paintings, they were what could be called disturbed paintings. In truth, because they were produced by disturbed artists, and you'll see what I mean. Some paintings, by the effect they have on the subjects portrayed or those who view them, are known as disturbed. They carry the essence of the artist that in some instances turns out to be unlucky or plain deadly. First one we're going to look at is an artist named Achille Gorky. Achille Gorky, born Vostanik Manug Adoin, is an Armenian-American artist born in 1904 in a village on the shores of Lake Van in the Ottoman Empire, present-day Turkey. His mother starved to death in 1919 while living in Yerevan, Armenia. As Armenian Christians, they were a minority who were oppressed by the Ottoman and later by the Turkish rulers. His mother, Sushan, was married at 14, and she witnessed when her young husband was murdered by Turkish soldiers for being part of a rebel force. When she was 19, she was wedded to a widower, Sedrak Adoyan, age 36. They had 3 children, and Gorky, being the only boy, was favored by his mother. She expected him to become a poet or a priest, but she also warned him that he would suffer a dark fate. She called him the Black One, the unlucky one who will come to a no-good end. As an adult, he called it the family curse. In 1920, he arrived in America and went to see his father, who had abandoned the family in 1908 and moved to Rhode Island. 3 years later, Gorky enrolled in the New England School of Art in Boston, but he was mostly self-educated. He was romantically involved with artist Corinne West, but in 1941 he married Agnes Magruder, a wealthy socialite, 20 years his junior. His pet name for her was Moguch, an Armenian endearment. As a true bohemian, she had moved in with him prior to their marriage. It seemed he was doomed to relive a pattern of abandonment with his choice of spouse. She said of their relationship, quote, "I told them that I felt it was quite impossible to be faithful. How one person couldn't be all things to everybody from birth to death. Surely there were all sorts of facets to everybody's personality. When I first went to live with him, I couldn't understand what I'd done. It was all right then because I had a bolt hole. I could go and see my parents or my grandfather in Cape Cod. I could do things, couldn't I? But once I was married, well, he didn't want me to go out anymore, working nights or days." End quote. 1946 was not a good year for Gorky. His studio, housed in a barn, burned down, taking 30 of his paintings and his library. It seemed this was a family tradition. His grandmother had set the local church on fire in revolt against God, who had allowed her son to be tortured by the Turks. So when his studio was burning, he acted as if under that curse, not informing the fire brigade, but trying to staunch the flames himself. After the fire, he painted an homage to the works he lost, naming 2 of his paintings Charred Beloved 1 and Charred Beloved 2. In 1947, he underwent surgery for colostomy for rectal cancer, and his estranged father died. During this time, his wife had an affair with fellow artist and friend Robert Mata. His wife left in the summer of 1948 with her two young daughters as she could no longer cope with her husband's depression and his increasing violence. She would go on to marry writer Zan Fielding. The same week she left, he was a passenger in a car driven by a gallery owner named Julian Levy, who crashed while under the influence of alcohol. Gorky's neck and back were broken, and he had to wear a neck brace. It temporarily paralyzed his painting arm. On July 19th, he returned home, driven by Isamu Noguchi, as well as Wilfredo Lam and his wife Helena. On the way, Gorky asked to stop to see Dr. Weiss, his psychiatrist. When he got back in the car, he told Noguchi that the doctor wants to perform a lobotomy on him. On July 21st, 1948, he told his students and a neighbor he meant to kill himself. Perhaps they didn't believe that he really meant to do it, but he did. He took off his neck brace and hung himself from the rafters of his barn studio in Connecticut. He wrote "Goodbye, my loveds" in chalk on a wooden crate. Ironically, a few weeks before, Life magazine had written a story about his barn studio. His barking dog brought a neighbor to the barn where his body was discovered. After Gorky died, Magruder traveled Europe with Mata, placing her children in a Swiss boarding school rather than allowing Gorky's sister in Chicago to adopt them. Was there something about Gorky's ill fortune which imbued his art? There are rumors that his paintings produced from 1904 to 1938 were cursed. In 2003, an Armenian activist told a researcher, quote, "Have you ever heard of Gorky's curse? There's a rumor going around the galleries of New York that Gorky's paintings are cursed. The painting, The Orators, has been damaged in a fire in 1957. Another painting, The Calendars, has been completely destroyed. Then there are rumors of paintings falling from walls and of a black-haired ghost in a blue overcoat that visits Gorky's old house in Sherman, Connecticut. The art dealers I have spoken with in New York are absolutely convinced that the work of Gorky is haunted." End quote. Now, on March 1st, 1962, it was already several years after he died, 15 of Gorky's paintings were on American Airlines Flight 1 to Los Angeles for an exhibition. 2 minutes after takeoff, the plane rolled over and crashed into a swamp, taking 87 passengers, 8 crew members, and Gorky's paintings into a muddy grave. Among the passengers were Admiral Richard Lansing Connolly, a retired Chief of Naval Operations, George T. Felbeck, VP of Union Carbide, West W. Alton Jones, former president and chairman of City Services Company and friend of Dwight D. Eisenhower, Louise Eastman of Eastman Kodak fame, whose daughter Linda would go on to marry Paul McCartney, and Emmeline Whitten, 1952 Olympic sailing gold medalist. In 1937, Gorky painted a portrait of his friend and fellow artist Anna Walinska. It would hang in her family's home for many years and was never publicly exhibited. The portrait was sold by Walinska in the late 1970s when her rent-stabilized apartment was converted into a co-op and she needed funds. The Bodley Gallery accepted it for consignment, but it didn't sell. An auction at Sotheby's failed to produce a buyer as well. A private broker at Sotheby's found a buyer where it was sold for next to nothing. It is one of about 50 of Gorky's paintings that have been lost through the years. In 2021, underneath one of Gorky's paintings, The Limit, Gorky's daughter Maro found another one of his missing works known as Untitled, or what they think as Virginia Summer, which is believed he produced in the summer of 1947. So it almost seems as either his paintings are destroyed or they've just disappeared, the bulk of them. I'm sure there's some out there floating and some are in private collections, but now the following, this is another a Ukrainian painter by the name of Ilya Repin. He was a famous 19th century Ukrainian painter who was born in 1844, and he was a teenager when he started to paint, and he won his first prize when he was 25 years old. In 1872, he was awarded a commission by the Grand Duke Alexander Alexandrovich. The same year he married Vera Shevtsova, and the 15-year marriage produced 4 children, during which Repin had various affairs. In 1885, He suffered a setback with his portrait of Ivan the Terrible killing his own son. That's the title of the painting, which caused a scandal and it was removed from exhibitions. Working on this painting paralyzed his right hand and he learned to work with his left hand. Eventually, Repin was given new commissions and received many accolades for his work throughout his life. Then in 1890 he met Natalia Norman, who became his common-law wife. In 1899 he built a country house called the Penates, where they lived for the next 30 years and entertained Russian society. He was appalled by the violence and terror the Bolsheviks demonstrated following the October Revolution. In 1914, Natalia sickened with tuberculosis and died. He died in 1930, age 86, and was buried at his country house. The terrible reaction to Repin's work came long before his death. He was an acclaimed artist, but being his subject carried a heavy cost not paid in money. It seemed many of his subjects died unnatural deaths after sitting for him. Between 1870 to 1873, Repin produced Barge Haulers on the Volga, which depicts 11 men dragging a barge on the bank of the Volga River. The men who were healthy when they posed began to die once it was completed. In the late 1870s, he painted A Man with an Evil Eye, using his godfather, Ivan Radov, as a model. Radov was known as a sorcerer, and Repin suffered from fevers once it was finished, which might have inspired the title of the painting. It exhibited in 1878 and received acclaim. Mussorgsky, Pismensky, Pirogov, pianist Louise Countess de Mercy Argenteau, Fyodor Tutachev died during or after Repin completed their portraits. Right after the artist finished his work, the ceremonial meeting of the State Council in 1903, officials who were painted on the canvas were killed during the First Russian Revolution of 1905. Prime Minister Stolpin was assassinated in Kiev in 1911 after Repin painted his portrait. Then in 1913, Abram Balashov slashed the painting Ivan the Terrible and his son Ivan 3 times, while he screamed, "Stop the bloodshed!" His final destination was a mental asylum. Georgy Kruzlov, the curator of the Tretyakov gallery who owned the painting, threw himself under a train when he learned of the act. The painting was restored with the help of Repin. It was kept on exhibition, and there were stories that those who saw it would be visited by anxiety and crying fits. In May 2018, the painting was damaged when a drunken visitor took a metal bar and broke the protective glass. It was pierced in 3 places, and the frame was badly damaged. The vandal was imprisoned for 2.5 years. So 100 years later, 1913, the painting is slashed. For those of you who are watching the video version of this, and you'll see the painting I'm talking about, this painting is on the disturbing side. I mean, it's very well painted. There's no doubt about it. But it makes you take a step back. A little over 100 years, May of 2018, somebody else attacks the painting. Very unusual. So, in other words, in Repin's case, it was sitting for him. That kind of was like a cursed effect, where regardless of whether you were, and like they said, it wasn't like, oh, he's painting somebody who's very elderly and maybe, it was nothing unusual in them dying. No, these were people who were not sick, not elderly, and they would just go on to drop dead or die very gruesome deaths. Now, the next set of paintings, let's move into more modern times, is called The Curse of the Clown. And believe it or not, even serial killers are artistic. If eyes are windows to the soul, then what are paintings produced by a human? What if that human is a killer? Many murderers have turned to producing art during the times they are incarcerated. Mostly the art is bad, and only the notoriety of their names brings it any attention. In some instances, whether knowingly or subconsciously, they give a glimpse into what feeds their souls. The first one we're looking at is John Wayne Gacy. Gacy was arrested in 1978. By then, he has sodomized and murdered 33 young men and boys, all between the ages of 14 and 21. 5 of his victims are still unidentified. He became a master of leading a double life. When he was 18, he became involved in politics and worked for a local Democratic Party candidate. He held numerous jobs. In the meantime, he joined the local Jaycees. He married in 1964 and worked for his father-in-law, who owned several Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants. Even though he was married, he engaged in homosexual encounters. By 1967, he had 2 children and was named vice president of the Waterloo Jaycees. This is in Iowa. Then in August of that year, he sexually assaulted the 15-year-old son of a fellow Jaycee and local politician. As a result of the arrest, he was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, with indicators he was likely to come into conflict with society. Well, that's an understatement. In 1968, he was convicted of sodomy and sentenced to 10 years. His wife divorced him, and she was granted sole custody of his 2 children, along with their home, property, and alimony. He never saw her or his children again. He served only 18 months of his sentence when he was granted parole. I never got that part. He married his second wife in 1972. She had 2 daughters from a previous marriage. 3 years later, he told her he was bisexual. And then one day, he told her this would be the last time they had intercourse. She observed her husband bring young men to the garage. She found gay pornography as well. They divorced in 1976. During these years, he dressed up as either Pogo the Clown or Patches the Clown. And he would perform at fundraising events, parades, and visiting hospitalized children, which was ironic because he was killing boys and young men at the same time. He continued in his work with Democratic Party politics. Gacy was caught when investigators were tipped off that Gacy had offered a job to Robert Piest, 15, who had gone missing. Police found he had a criminal record that involved sodomy, and a search warrant was granted for his property. Authorities found 26 bodies in the crawl space of his house. 3 were buried somewhere on the property, and 4 were thrown into the Des Plaines River. He typically garroted his victims to death with a hammer handle. Some victims convulsed for an hour or 2 before dying. He was accused of killing 33 young men, but he told investigators that the body count was as high as 45. A retired police officer said he had reason to believe there might be victims buried in the grounds of an apartment building on West Miami Avenue in Chicago, where Gacy was a caretaker for several years. After his arrest, Gacy named some of his employees as participating in the murders. He pointed a finger at Philip Pask, who was a close associate of John Norm, who during the 1970s operated a nationwide sex trafficking ring based in Chicago known as the Delta Project. There was speculation Gacy was tied to this trafficking ring as well. After his arrest in 1978, the jury took less than 2 hours to find him guilty and sentence him to death. His execution was set for 1980, but he would spend 14 years on death row. This is when he began to paint. He was executed by lethal injection on May 10, 1994, and his last words were, "Kiss my ass." The same year of his execution, his attorney auctioned off his artwork. Some of it was purchased, and 25 were destroyed in a bonfire attended by 300 people, including some family member of Gacy's victims. His brain was removed and is in the possession of Helen Morrison, a witness for the defense at Gacy's trial, who had interviewed him and other serial killers in a study of common personality traits of violent sociopaths. His body was cremated. Gacy's pathology has been connected to an abusive relationship with his alcoholic father. He was molested when he was 5 by a neighborhood girl who was 15 years old. When he was 8, he was molested by a contractor working on a building next to his house. In 2021, Cook County identified another Gacy victim through the use of DNA. His name was Francis Wayne Alexander, and he moved to Chicago in 1975. His marriage ended in a divorce a few months later. His family lost touch with him, but had no idea he was victim number 5 found under Gacy's house in 1978. DNA taken from a molar was connected to a family member in 2020. After 40-some years, they found out what had become of him. They never suspected this was his fate, since during those years, Alexander had cut off communication with him because he wanted to be left alone. His family was from Long Island, and he is interred in Oak Ridge Glen Oak Cemetery in Cook County, Illinois. Gacy's artwork was first exhibited in 2011 at the Contemporary Art Center Gallery in Las Vegas. It was titled Multiples, the Artwork of John Wayne Gacy, and it was received with negative criticism. A claim that proceeds of sales would go to the National Center for Victims of Crimes would turn out to be untrue. The organization stated, quote, "We believe the idea of benefiting from an activity relating to such egregious and violent crimes would be in poor taste to the extreme. Out of respect for the victims' families, we have not agreed and would not agree to accept any contribution that comes from the sale of John Wayne Gacy's work, which he did while in prison for torturing and murdering young boys and men." End quote. In 2011, the gallery's website described the collection this way, quote, 74 pieces will be put up for sale at the Las Vegas exhibition. They include pencil drawings and audio recordings and paintings of skulls, clowns, and the seven dwarfs from the Snow White fairy tale. Included among the collection is an oil painting entitled Dahmer's Skull, which is priced at $2,000 and was inspired by serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer. Perhaps the most controversial piece is a self-portrait entitled Goodbye Pogos, listed at $4,500. Gacy reportedly gave these portraits to close pen pals at the end of his life. End quote. In 1999, Johnny Depp spoke about owning Pogo the Clown. He said, "They told me when I got it that the proceeds went to a charity or to the victims' families or something, but I found out that wasn't the case, so I got rid of it. It was too dark anyway. Fascinating from a psychological point of view, but that was really dark stuff." In 2001, musician Nicky Stone bought Gacy's self-portrait Pogo the Clown. By 2005, the allure had more than worn off. In fact, he wanted to get rid of the piece. He'd bought it for $3,000 from murderabilia merchant Arthur Rosenblatt, and he suffered for it in ways he had not anticipated. His dog had died and his mother was diagnosed with cancer. He never even had the opportunity to hang it. A friend stored the painting for him, and the friend's neighbor was killed in an auto accident. Another friend who tried to help by keeping the painting attempted suicide. In 2005, it was turned over to consignment art dealer and owner of Kaleidoscope Tattoo and Art in Cambridge, named Sean McCarran. McCarran felt that he was inured from bad luck since his mother Maureen was stabbed to death in her home in 1999. His brother Mark had also been stabbed but made it to a nearby fire station to get help. A man who had been drinking all night at a party across from the home was eventually arrested. He knew McCarran's mother socially and had done work at the house in the weeks before she was killed. In 2002, the perpetrator was found guilty of first-degree murder, which carried a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. McCarran said of the painting, "I'm not afraid of it. I don't believe in the hocus pocus and the bad mojo that comes with it. Every murderer in the world should be rolled into one. They all owe me. People do ask to see it. They get a chill through their body. I've had people say, 'Oh my God, put that back in the box.'" In 2020, Zach Bagans purchased some of Gacy's paintings from Tammy Hoff, Gacy's stepdaughter. She had received many of the paintings while he was on death row. Gacy's paintings are known for being especially high in demand, going for anywhere from $6,000 to $175,000. One he did of his house, which emphasized the crawl space where he hid his victims, is the most sought-after Gacy illustration. In 2022, it was reported a set of Gacy's paintings were up for auction. They had been found in a cupboard in a house in England. The owners of the property had died, and the son found them. The three paintings had been there for decades, and he had no idea his parents had purchased them. He believed they were acquired when his parents toured the United States. They are titled Christ, Skull Clown, and Hi Ho in the Winter '92, and are all signed by Gacy. They were set to be auctioned by Mullock's Auctioneers in Shropshire. They fetched the following amount. Christ went for £1,100, Skull Clown £1,200, and they were sold in the first auction in June of 2022, and Hi Ho in the Winter '92 sold in July for £900. The question begs to be asked why they were kept secreted away in a cupboard gathering dust for so many years. Or another is, who would want them to begin with? Now, the next set of paintings, you could call them hexed paintings, right? And you'll see what I mean. Are the stories about these cursed paintings real or just urban tales? The first one that we're going to look at is titled The Anguished Man. The story started out as a creepypasta. The painting was allegedly produced by an unknown artist where he mixed his blood into the paint and, after finishing the portrait, committed suicide. Sean Robinson inherited the piece from his grandmother, who believed it was cursed, and told him the story of the origins of the painting. Like other stories of haunted portraits, once it was hung up, there were sightings of shadowy figures, inarticulate whispers, and crying. Robinson, who lives in Cumbria, UK, uploaded videos in 2010 of the strange happenings in his home. He heard scrapings in the basement where the painting was stored, and fog appeared at the top of his stairs. Once he saw the figure of a man. Others who viewed the painting experienced nausea and nosebleeds. In 2016, rights were acquired to make a film based on the painting. I don't know. And I haven't heard anything about any film on it, but you never know when they're going to come up with that. Or if they, I don't know. I mean, I could see where this could turn out to soon be hitting the, well, not the big screen because nobody goes to the movie theaters anyway, but yeah, somebody will come up and use that story. But anyway, the next painting is titled Untitled. In other words, it was never titled. And this is why. Stanisław Bekinski was a Polish artist who did not title any of his paintings. He suffered from OCD, which made him resistant to travel, and he referred to his condition as neurotic diarrhea. He studied architecture, but had no formal training as an artist. From the 1960s to the 1980s, he created disturbing images showing a gloomy, surrealistic environment with detailed scenes of death, decay, landscapes filled with skeletons, deformed figures, and deserts. He said that he didn't know the meaning of his work and was not interested in interpreting them, which is why he refused to provide titles for them. Bekinski's wife Zoila died in 1998, and a year later, on Christmas Eve 1999, he discovered his son Tomas's body, who committed suicide by a drug overdose. In 2005, Bekinski was killed after being stabbed 17 times. The perpetrator was the son of his longtime caretaker and friend, who was sentenced to 25 years in prison, along with an accomplice to 5 years. The crime was spurred on when Bekinski refused to lend the perpetrator $100. There's a belief by some that anyone who looks at the paintings for a long time will soon die. And when you see these paintings, again, for those watching the videos, you'll know what I mean. You could see this guy was an artist, but his subject matter is, again, very disturbing. Now, the next painting is titled Man Proposes, God Disposes. This painting dates back to 1864, in which the artist interprets what happened to Sir John Franklin's expedition who disappeared in the Arctic in 1845. It is housed at the Royal Holloway University of London. During exam season, it is covered by a Union flag because the rumor is that in the 1970s a student committed suicide after staring at the painting. His note read, "The polar bears made me do it." Others comment the painting makes them feel uneasy. The artist is Edwin Landseer, who gave a grim outcome to the expedition sent out to explore the Northwest Passage with the two ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. Even though they were provisioned with food for several years, they were never heard from again. Search parties were sent out, and Captain John Ray was given hints of sightings by the Inuit. He found some bodies on King William Island, and there were reports of possible cannibalism by the survivors. In 1869, another expedition found the remains of 2 sailors from the Erebus on King William Island. The myth attached to viewing the painting dates back to at least the 1920s or the 1930s, which was that anyone sitting in front of the painting before taking an exam would fail it. The suicide of the unfortunate student has never been verified. Let me tell you something. It's very disturbing. The polar bears made me do it. Again, for those watching the video version of this, basically the painting is what looks like the wreckage of a ship and 2 polar bears eating some bones, so it makes it look like he interpreted it as they never came back because they were being eaten by polar bears. I guess his imagination didn't go far out enough to realize, no, they were eating each other. Anyway, let's go back now. No, let's go ahead now to more modern times. This is a painting called The Hands Resist Him. Bill Stoneham produced the piece in 1974 at a time when his first wife, Rowan, had written a poem titled Hands Resist Him. It was about her husband's experience of being adopted and never knowing his biological parents. He was adopted when he was 9 months old from an orphanage in Massachusetts. The painting did not gain notoriety until 2000, when it was placed on eBay as a haunted item. Stoneham said the boy in the painting is based on a photograph of himself at age 5 when he was living in Chicago. The doll was a female playmate who posed in the picture with him. The doorway in the painting demarks a separation between the waking world and the world of fantasy and impossibilities. The life-size doll next to him is a guide. It was first shown at Feingarten Gallery in Beverly Hills during the 1970s. The piece was bought by John Marley, who played Jack Woltz in The Godfather. A California couple found the painting at the site of an old brewery turned into an art space. Where it was during those years after it was sold to Marley and why it was left where it was remains a mystery. The couple who put it up for sale on eBay described it had a curse on it. Besides the description, they included photographs where the doll was threatening the boy with a gun she was holding, which is when he attempted to leave the painting. There was a disclaimer to release the seller from liability once it was purchased. The listing read, quote, "At the time we wondered a little why seemingly perfect fine painting would be discarded like that. Today we don't. One morning, our 4.5-year-old daughters claimed that the children in the picture were fighting and coming into the room during the night." The painting received 30 bids and sold for $1,025 to Perception Gallery. Many who had looked at the painting while it was up for sale had unpleasant experiences. According to the Spokesman Review, another reported that he became ill while viewing the painting and had to burn white sage to cleanse his house afterward. Another reported blackout/mind control experiences. After receiving 30,000 hits on the listing before the auction was finalized, the sellers backtracked and wrote, "There are no ghosts in this world, no supernatural powers. This is just a painting, and most of these things have an explanation. In this case, probably a fluke light effect." Perception Gallery contacted Stoneham and told him the story of the sale of the painting on eBay. He was unaware of the stories, but did relate the death between 1978 and 1984 of 3 of the men closest to the painting, The Hands Resist Him. In February 1978, Henry Seldis, the LA Times art critic, was found dead in his apartment, which was listed by police as a suicide. He was suffering from depression due to a divorce and had tried to take an overdose of pills in September 1977 during a first suicide attempt. In 1981, Charles Feingarten died from cancer at age 60. John Marley died in 1984 following open-heart surgery. He was 77 years old. In 2004, Stoneham was commissioned to paint a sequel, which was titled Resistance at the Threshold, which was completed in 2012. He then produced a prequel titled The Hands Invent Him. The Haunted Museum acquired the prequel painting in 2017. In 2021, Stoneham created the final painting called What Remains. So again, what was created, the original artist had no idea this was going on. That once he sold it, everybody that owned it kind of died. One guy died by suicide, the other guy died, he was only 60. Everybody, and the people that put it on eBay find it out in the back of in other words, it was being thrown out, or like when people put it out there, like, yeah, we don't want it. Very interesting. And he did sequels to it. Now, the next picture is, or the next painting, I'm sorry, is called Replica of the Love Letters. And this is a painting, a reproduction of an original painting. It's very unusual the way this curse takes place or how it works out. This painting is haunted by association. It hangs on the fifth floor of the Driscoll Hotel in Austin, Texas, where Samantha Houston, 4, died when she fell from a flight of steps where she was playing with a leather ball. The hotel had just opened the year before. The painting is said to look like the unfortunate Samantha, and people who stay at the hotel claim the girl's expression changes. Others have seen the phantom of the little girl playing ball around it. Her father was Senator Temple Houston, and her grandfather was General Sam Houston. Her sister Louise, age 2, died that same year from cholera infantum and was buried in the same Mobeetie cemetery as Samantha. In 1897, the couple lost another baby that was 1 month old. The painting, titled Replica of Love Letters, was produced by Richard King from an original painted by Charles Trevor Garland, a British artist. People who have viewed it, not only the one in the hotel, but replicas, report a nausea and uneasy feelings around it that they cannot account for since the subject is so innocuous. And if anyone sees it, this is very Victorian looking production, a young girl holding a letter. Nothing disturbing at it at first blush. But there you go. And by the way, this Houston family, they look to be like they were kind of cursed. They lost 3 small children. But anyway, let's go on to the next painting. This is titled The Ghost of Galvez. Bernardo Vicente de Galvez y Madrid, who was the first Count of Galvez, served as governor of Spanish Louisiana and Cuba. He was a soldier most of his life, serving in Europe, the Americas, and North Africa. He sided with the colonists when they fought the British during the Revolutionary War. He drove the British out of Florida's west coast. Galvez Day is a holiday in Pensacola, and Galveston, Texas, an island he never actually visited, is named in his honor. So how did this man end up haunting his portrait, which he himself commissioned in the 1780s? It hangs at the Grand Galvez Resort and Spa, and guests report the eyes of the Count follow them around, which could be a well-known effect many artists employed. However, there's something else which is quite strange. Those who take a picture only get a blurry image, that is, unless they ask permission first. Perhaps it's not the painting, but the place itself. In 1900, the Great Galveston Hurricane made landfall. It ravaged the island and swept away the St. Mary's Orphan Asylum. Only 3 children out of 93 orphans and 10 nuns survived. Their bodies were not recovered, and it's believed some of their remains were buried under the debris of the orphanage. It was on the site of where St. Mary's once stood that the Grand Galvez opened its doors in 1911, after 10 years of construction at the cost of $1 million. Another hurricane roared into Galveston in 1915, killing 275 persons, but the hotel, unlike the orphanage, survived. A speakeasy operated there during Prohibition, and during the years of World War II, it became a U.S. Coast Guard station, devoid of tourists, of course. Reports of unusual phenomena came from all around the 226-room structure, but room 501 is connected to the Ghost Bride. The story is that a young woman would look out to sea from a hatch on the roof waiting for her lover, who was a sailor, to return. News reached her he had been lost at sea with the ship. She hung herself in the west turret of the hotel. The reason for her haunting the room is evident. A little girl with a ball is seen in the lower floors, and a man is sighted in the hotel laundry. Children's laughter is heard near one of the bathrooms and the music hall. A ghostly maid has been seen, and a man who walks into a closed door. No doubt the source of these phantoms is a cast of hundreds, considering how long the hotel has been there. But there is something that occurred only 3 years after the Galvez Hotel opened its doors that could account for an unhappy spirit, and it's known as the Woman in White. In 1914, the body of a pretty girl was found shot to death on Galveston Beach near the hotel. The suicide theory didn't hold water since there were no powder burns at the head wound, and no weapon was discovered. There were no signs of a struggle. Residents on the boulevard didn't hear gunfire or an outcry. She didn't have any identifying marks on her clothing, which were of fine texture. She didn't have any jewelry on her. She was discovered by an employee of the Galvez Hotel, who found the body lying partially covered with sand from the high tide. Physicians who examined the body found the bullet had passed directly through and would have killed her instantly. If there were bloodstains at the scene, they were washed away by the waves. The police suspected she was the daughter of a wealthy family, and she was lured to the spot and robbed of her jewelry and money. The woman was wearing an expensive white dress of sheer material, new tan shoes, and silk stockings to match. Nearby was her Panama hat and one glove. She had long, luxuriant black hair, gray eyes, and she had no makeup on her face. She was about 5 feet 5 inches tall. Later in the afternoon, a miniature figure of the Virgin Mary was found near the body. The police were following up to see if she attended services at St. Mary's Cathedral. On July 22, 1914, the newspapers announced it was thought the woman was Mrs. George Hopper of Cleburne, Texas, which turned out to be wrong. The police discovered that the night of the murder, there were several quarrels along the beach. A man and woman drove up to the resort. The man made accommodations, but the woman refused to leave the car. Then a violent quarrel started until the couple drove away. Finally, on July 24th, the woman was identified by her cousins as Elvira Davis of San Antonio. She was the private secretary and librarian to capitalist George W. Brackenridge. One theory the police held was that, considering she was scantily clad and she was not wearing underskirts or petticoats, she was murdered in the hotel, dressed, and brought to the beach. Brackenridge said he had received a business letter from the girl the week before, but there was no mention of ending her life, which later he disavowed. Another rumor was that she feared she would be struck down by cancer, which had caused the death of a sister. She also suffered from chronic rheumatism. The police also theorized that she was a member of an automobile party who rode to the beach where she was killed for some unknown reason. The coroner rendered a verdict of came to her death by a bullet fired by some person or persons unknown. 2 weeks later, Governor Colquitt offered a reward of $200 for the arrest and conviction of the murderer or murderess. Despite the coroner's verdict, by the first week of August, the grand jury held that the victim killed herself. However, the police insisted that she was killed by a man. It was never explained why there was a change in the reason for her death. The police chief said they even doubted that the identity of the woman was Miss Davis. Chief Parrott stated he could secure affidavits that the woman was not more than 24 years old, and Elvira Davis was 44 years old. This and the fact there were no powder burns on her head, and there was no water in her lungs, threw into doubt she died by her own hand. There were marks and bruises on her face which indicated she had been beaten before she died. She also had fingerprints on the neck. Contradicting she was killed by someone else was a farewell letter sent to her employer and a telegram to Dr. Schaefer, her friend. She told him that hereditary rheumatism was overcoming her and she had no one depending on her. She didn't want to become helpless and dependent upon others. Her parents and 4 of her siblings were all dead already. So, did Elvira commit suicide or was she murdered? Was it even the body of Elvira? 4 years before death, she was living in Benicia, California. After the inquest, the search for the killer died away, despite the police's belief she met with foul play. Perhaps she is one of those that doesn't like quiet in her grave and haunts the Galvez Hotel. The next story is titled The Children's Bones. And undoubtedly, historic homes develop a reputation for being haunted. In some cases, it's undeserved, and other times, there's no doubt that something still walks the halls and paths of what once was its home. Now, there's a picture or painting at the rear staircase of a house known as Wollerton Hall. Now, the following is an allegedly true story told by someone who visited Wollerton Hall. This is in the UK several times. Quote, in Wollerton Hall, Nottingham, in the rear staircase is a mural of Roman priests, worshippers, and attendants going into a temple. It's okay, not outstanding. It's painted onto, I believe, a huge canvas rather than into the plaster. It was made in the 18th century based on the style. So when painters work on a painting, they often draft out the composition first, then work over it in layers. Later on the life of a picture, this underlayer can bleed through and appear in the upper surface as shadows and outlines. In the painting I'm speaking of, which must be at least 5 16 feet across and 3 high, there's a couple of places where you can see underpainting. A basket of fruit and leaves was moved a bit. Someone has a raised hand that was later pointing. And then in the corner, in the cloak of a priest and in the robes of an attendant, are the faces of 2 little children, chubby-cheeked, painted beautifully. They don't fit the composition. There are overfigures already sketched in where they are. The faces are very well done, although blurry, not a quick outline, so why are the faces bleeding through there? So I've not mentioned Wollaton Hall is an Elizabethan building, full of little staircases and hidden corners. Well, there was work done on the building, I think during the 1920s, according to their lovely chief archivist, and behind that painting, covered over, was a little room, and in the room unknown to everyone were the remains of 2 little boys. We don't know how they got there, stuck, lost, or disposed of, but the door, which was from one of the adjoining rooms, had been lost to time. I don't think the little skeletons have ever been dated. They're probably interred somewhere in the city now, but every time I cross the hallway, I just catch a glimpse of these 2 little chubby faces under the painting appearing more and more over time, and I always think some things really can't be hitting. And obviously the inference is that the children's faces, which like this person is describing, they don't fit. And by the way, when they say Roman priest, they don't mean like Catholic priest. They're like Roman times priest. This is like that kind of composition. In other words, these children in the little corner, there's nothing there for them to be there. They don't fit there. And the inference is, of course, that these are the ghosts of those 2 children. Now, Wollaton Hall was built in 1580 for Sir Francis Willoughby. It would take 8 years to complete the house, and no expense was spared. There were about 200 statues decorating the estate, and the chimneys curved to meet in the middle in the form of a crown. 7 miles of wall enclosed the park. In 1642, a fire broke out and destroyed part of the Great Hall and spread to 2 sides of the house. By the early 18th century, Queen Anne had created a baronetcy for the family, and they became known as the Middleton family. In 1926, after the death of Godfrey Ernest Percival Willoughby, 10th Baron Middleton, the hall and the 800-acre estate passed into the hands of the Nottingham Corporation due to death duties. The Natural History of Museum was opened on the premises soon after. Perhaps it was during this transition that the skeletons described in the report were found. However, there is no mention in any of the newspapers that they had made this discovery. Perhaps it was kept out of the press so it wouldn't hurt the image of the new museum. The museum stayed open except during World War II, when it was occupied at various times for use by the Army as a schoolroom for pupils of Radford Boulevard School and a camp for German Italian prisoners of war. Wollaton Hall is said to be haunted. The most persistent is the White Lady, who walks the half-roof at night, even though she was not seen for many years. There is an orange glow that comes from the window of room 19, which was once Lady Middleton's room, even when no electricity is turned on. An attendant at the hall for 6 years, who lived in an apartment in the stable, saw it more than once. The first time was around 1971, when he was walking through the park with one of the gardeners and his wife. The 2 men believed someone had broken in, and as they got closer, the light went out. They checked, and the electricity was off at the main switch, and the door to the room was locked. Another time was in 1974, when the attendant saw it, and so did his wife. They didn't investigate. The burglar alarms did not go off. Room 19 is just below the roof where the White Lady is said to walk. Some wonder if she is the one that causes the mysterious footsteps on the stairs, in the rooms, and even on the garden path. In 1973, the hall was being rewired, and an electrician heard footsteps on the uncarpeted wooden treads. He stepped aside in order to allow the person to go past, but all he heard were footsteps go by him. Nobody was there. He felt the temperature become very cold. He dropped his tools, went down the stairs, and out of the building. One of the attendants saw him leave and never return. In 1974, an attendant was standing near the inquiry desk when he heard a low whistle and someone walking across the minstrel's gallery from left to right. He went upstairs to look, thinking it was a live person. The gallery was empty. When he came back down, he heard the same thing again. In the Admiral's bathroom, which is an underground room containing a spring where a member of the Middleton family used to take his daily bath, the sound of laughter was heard when there is no one there. The museum's school officer had an office in the Northeast Tower. In 1975, one day she was up at the top of the tower, close to the rooms that were used for storage. She heard a child's voice coming from behind one of the doors. She couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like an excited girl. She knew the room was empty and locked. In 1975, the curator at Woolton Hall said that when any of the employees had to do fire watching duties in the hall, none wanted to stay in the hall alone. In the stable block bedroom, doors are closed and open, and footsteps are heard on the stairs, followed by a knock on the door when there is no one there. In 1980, the museum was redone and a new exhibition was opened in the Great Hall, officiated by Lord Middleton. Woolton Hall was used in the film The Dark Knight Rises in 2011 as the Wayne Manor. In 2021, the fossil of Titus the T-Rex, which was found in the Montana Badlands in 2018, were put on display. In 2023, the Antiques Roadshow was filmed on the grounds of Woolton Hall. As for the discovery of bones belonging to children, there is no story found that connects Woolton Hall to this story. Many people are familiar with the discovery in 1674 of two children's skeletons found at the Old Tower of London under a staircase that was renamed the Two Princes Staircase. It was believed these were the bones of the princeling sons of King Edward IV, who died in 1483. The boys were taken by their uncle Richard III and kept in the White Tower, after which time they were never seen again. A perfunctory examination were made of the bones in 1933, which concluded that the remains were those of children roughly the same age of 9 and 12. They were reburied in Westminster Abbey. Two more bodies that may have been princes were found in 1789 at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. Permission has never been granted so forensic scientists can conduct DNA and other forensic analysis on either sets of remains in order to make a proper identification. So we've come to the end of this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Please don't forget to sign up for my newsletter at mppellicer.com or miamighostchronicles.com. Remember, there you can find links to videos, also to the podcast versions of any of the shows, not only Stories of the Supernatural, but Nightshade Diary, also Supernatural Storytime, and of course, Eerie.news. I will be seeing you soon again with another fantastic guest. Till then.